Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We're talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today's episode is brought to you by Anthem, and I'm delighted to be joined by the wonderful Rachel Collar. Rachel, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me along. It's an absolute pleasure.
Now, a bit of behind the scenes gossip for everybody. Rachel and I have been trying to make this episode happen for a few weeks, but unfortunately, neighbors are neighbors and they want to build things, they want to renovate, they want to do loft conversions. So we've been waiting for a silent space in our lives so that we can make this happen. So I'm glad we're finally here. It feels like I've been looking forward to it for a long time. Now, before we talk culture and before we talk about leadership challenges and what you can do about them, tell me about your world. You're the founder of Haus of HR. You're running your own business. HR, I guess, has been your universe for a little while. So tell us what you're doing in the world and what you're trying to get done.
Well, it's been part of my world since university days. So I did my degree in HR, and it kind of really wasn't called HR then. That's many years ago. And I was really, really lucky. I landed a job straight with Accenture for finishing university. And I really hit that kind of fast-paced world of HR in that large corporate setting. Over the years, I took roles, always keep increasing that responsibility. And then working with Mercedes-Benz Truck was a significant milestone. And that's where I had to kind of go in and set up the HR team from absolute scratch. But it was during that pandemic when some people know the story already. I do talk about it a lot, but my husband hates it. But he suffered a heart attack during the pandemic. And that was then that real profound realization that I loved what I do, but I just didn't love the way I was doing it. So that's where I kind of really took a step back. I did the whole self-help books, podcasts, talking to people that had run their own business, been successful, not been successful, people that knew me that were risk averse, not risk averse, and really thought I'd get this balanced view on, do it, don't do it. But everyone was like, do it. So ultimately I had to launch Haus of HR and Haus of Coaching that's in the background as well. And it very much, that transition from that corporate world to my own business was kind of really driven by both personal and professional factors for me. So it was after my husband's heart attack that's when I really knew I'd experienced a deep sense of burnout. And it really made me reevaluate my priorities and what I wanted in life. And I realized that while I enjoyed the work, I knew deep down, and probably for many, many years, that the corporate environment wasn't conducive to my well-being. So I spent a lot of time reflecting on what truly mattered, how I could make a meaningful impact. And ultimately that led to me starting my own business where I now create my culture and hopefully help other organizations thrive in a much more authentic and sustainable way as well.
So it sounds like it's been quite a dramatic and traumatic journey, but also one that has been immensely fulfilling for you as you've begun to rethink based on some pretty tough circumstances. You've begun to rethink, what's the direction of my life? What's the direction of my business? What do I want to be about? What do I want to do in the world? And I love the way you refer to it as that pandemic, right? You know, we've all got that pandemic story, that flipping pandemic that sits in the background for many of us these days. You know, one of the reasons why I'm running Anthem is I experienced a redundancy on the back of that pandemic, you know, and whilst it wasn't a straight line from being made redundant to starting my own business, it was a big part of that story about why I started to think about what could I do differently? How could I shape my own role? How could I contribute to the culture that other people experience where they work and lead? So there's some nice harmonies between your story and my own. Though, of course, we do wish your husband all the best. I mean, I understand that he's well recovered now.
He is and fighting fit, so thank you.
One of the things I wanted to make mention of is on your LinkedIn profile, in your name, it says the HR rock star, I think. So tell us about that, because I know that people like to put little funny nods in their LinkedIn profile names these days, but you went with HR Rockstar. Tell us about that and why you chose it.
Well, I didn't start out with it because when I launched my own business 3 years ago, I had a profile on LinkedIn, but it was a typical boring CV. I never engaged with it as a platform. I might go on it the odd occasion because when you spend a lot of your career disciplining and dismissing people for what they put on social media, I kind of just steer clear of it. So when I started to have to play around with it as a sales tool, I come up with kind of different little taglines. I saw what other people did. I started kind of sharing bits of my story. And then I just thought, you know what? I'd worked with an organization, an American organization, where we were always about recruiting the next rock star. So I thought, you know what? I'm my own HR rock star. So I decided to call myself HR Rockstar. So why would people remember me? And I was told by people, you're going to break their LinkedIn. You're going to go into LinkedIn jail for doing this. You're not allowed to muck around with your surname, all that fun stuff. I was like, fine, we'll see if it happens. But it stuck for nearly 3 years. But then obviously I was really finding myself during that journey as well of sharing me and everyone saying people buy from people and all that stuff we hear all the time. And I just thought, I'm still not being my true self. So if everybody knows my love of music, I kind of, my era was the grunge era. I was a big Red Hot Chili Peppers, Pearl Jam fan. Obviously, they were covered in tattoos. I'm heavily covered in tattoos and have been for many years. And I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to shake this world up a little bit and let's have some fun with it along the way. So that's kind of how it was born, really, and helping me break out my identity on LinkedIn.
And it worked, right? Because one of the reasons, I'm not sure, I can't quite remember where we connected, but I know that one of the reasons, like, I think I saw your name, HR Rockstar, and obviously a lot of what I'm talking about with Anthem and through the podcast is very HR adjacent, I would say. I think for me that culture is, in lots of business, culture sort of ends up belonging to the HR department as a thing to shape and lead. I think it needs to be released from having that kind of that narrow point of view sometimes. But being HR adjacent, and I saw your title, I thought, Rachel looks interesting. And then obviously I looked into your profile and saw what you're doing in the world, and I thought, Rachel is interesting. I need to get her on the show. So HR Rockstar, it's a title that's working for you. Now, I did notice, anyone visiting your profile will also notice that you've got some accolades to your name. I think you're the top 100 UK female entrepreneur. You're on that list. So am I right? Have I got that right? And also, tell us what that award is, what that means, and how that kind of entered your universe.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was about a year ago that I got nominated and had to keep it embargoed, I think, until earlier this year. But yes, so every year, Small Business Britain recognises 100 female entrepreneurs in the UK, across the whole of the UK, and brings us all together. And we came together on International Women's Day back in March this year to celebrate our success, because obviously female entrepreneurs are a minority. So it's about celebrating all that we've achieved, what we've still got to achieve. And we did that at the House of Lords, which was absolutely amazing. And I think I've had lots of opportunities to connect with so many inspirational women through that journey and supporting each other. So we continue to meet socially, and we do a lot of continuous professional development sessions with each other. And I actually have got to meet quite a few of them at other different events that I've been to across the UK as well. So we've created a really nice community. We're part of the community that wins every year, but it's really nice to be recognised in 2024 in that group that I've grown and developed with.
Congratulations. I'm sure that was a really special day, but such a great acknowledgement of what you're doing with your business and how you're trying to grow it. Now, being a female entrepreneur and working in a space that lots of people overlook in business, I think sometimes HR gets a bit of a bad rep with people. What's your kind of dream or ambition here for this business? So you're an entrepreneur, you're growing something great. What does the future look like for you in this role, do you think?
God, really interesting. I think people have these 5 years plans, all these things that are going to happen. And I think I went into it thinking, as long as I had enough money to pay the bills and go on nice holidays, I didn't really have an agenda. So definitely my business strategy, while I've had plans there, and obviously a business plan, all that fun stuff that you have, ultimately for me, it was been about having fun, having the flexibility. If I don't want to work on a Friday, I don't work on a Friday. Still not always happens that way. But also one of my big passions was about volunteering. So for me, it's all not always been about driving revenue and growth. It's been about doing some stuff that fulfills me as well. And the volunteering I've done, I've worked with Toaster Food Bank. I'm a trustee board member with Trilogy Active, and I'm also a non-executive director for Northamptonshire and Milton Keynes Chamber of Commerce. And I've done lots of other different volunteering for Alzheimer's and other charities across the course of the last 3 years. If I'd said to an MD in one of my other businesses, or can I have every other Friday off to do some volunteering work, I know what the answer would have been. So for me, that's been really important. But ultimately, it's been about, for businesses from a HR perspective, yes, HR doesn't have to be dull and boring. We don't have to be, the HR police and tell you what to do and not to do. I typically will work with clients who generally care about their people, want to do good by them, want to see them grow and develop and stay with them, and really, want to invest a lot of time in them. Ultimately, I don't want to go back to employed role, but if I was to, with the clients I work with, ultimately, do you know what? I would work for them. That's the type of clients I kind of work with. So I've cherry picked my clients to work with. If you're hire and fire all day long, I'm not the consultant for you. If you generally want to grow your people and see them thrive, then ultimately that's what I want to achieve. And that's where Haus of Coaching comes in as well. So I'm a qualified executive and leadership coach, and that's definitely working with people either on one-to-one or in team development sessions, again, about them growing and thriving and developing their skill set and ultimately staying with the organisation. That might not always be the answer, but yes, it's kind of been, I suppose, come kind of around full circle in my career. Everything I've got up there, what I can share with all organisation, but ultimately the big part of me is around that well-being, engagement, and retention is the real big things I try and work with my clients on.
So this coaching element of your world, right? I guess it's about professional growth, personal growth, helping people to become the very best version of themselves where they work and lead. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of like the vibe I'm picking up here. And sort of becoming who you are does relate to the conversation we touched on slightly just a few moments ago about your tattoos and how your relationship, I know from our previous conversation that your relationship with your tattoos has changed, and your willingness to display them as part of Rachel Collar, the brand, and not cover them up and hide them away. So tell us about your tattoos in a little bit more detail, and tell us how your relationship, how your point of view on how they can show up and show up in your world, how's that changed?
Gosh, I suppose it started for me was, being in the HR department, 25 plus years ago, the dress code policies were pretty strict in most places that I worked in. Tattoos might not have been mentioned in a lot of policies back then. And I knew it was a very taboo subject because when I had my first tattoo done when I was at university, I remember being at a nightclub and these two guys walked up to me and I just had a scorpion done on my back and they just said to me, whore. And I was like, really taken aback from that. That's not what I expected. And that was a lot, the perception was that, it was prostitutes that had tattoos and all of that negativity around, particularly women having tattoos then, 27 plus years ago, was quite an unusual thing. So I just started collecting tattoos on my back, thinking I can cover them up. No one sees them. Even I couldn't see them, but it was my way of expressing myself, but in a way that then I wasn't getting judged, or definitely not getting judged in a work world as well. At uni, I'd had nose pierced, different hair colours. I was kind of that rebel that wanted to do everything different. And I then conformed to this corporate world and the corporate dress codes and everything. And I just continued collecting my tattoos. Eventually, I ran out of room on the back and they spread elsewhere. I found more increasingly a lot of organisations I worked with had strict policies that were coming around about tattoos in terms of their brand, what that perceived, people finding tattoos offensive, particularly if you had something that might be perceived to be offensive towards somebody else. And particularly I found that outside of work. I've got a chest tattoo, and when I first had that done, I'd have people walk the opposite side of the road to me. Comments made to me that I escaped from prison break and all those things. So they're fun things I can reflect on now. But believe you me, in my time, I've had some personally outside of work, some quite negative quite upsetting things said to me. And I decided to release, as part of my journey of breaking free from the corporate world, was to do a post of a headshot with me with my tattoos on show and one without on show. And I was a bit anxious about doing it, but it went viral and I hadn't expected that. And the first thing that happened was the keyboard warriors came out in force. And that shocked me because I thought on a professional platform, I can see who you are, who you work for. Your colleagues can see that. Your company can see that. People who didn't know me writing really I would call quite nasty things. And I found that really upsetting. But that's kind of first day. Second day, the supportive people came out. They came out in their droves. They wrote wonderful comments and supportive. And like, hurrah, at last somebody, is coming out in the HR world. But sadly, I had people in the HR profession message me privately to say, oh, it's great you can do this, but I still think I can't do that where I work, especially doing the role I do in HR. We are seen as kind of that police and authority and setting that example. But obviously I can set my own agenda. And I think for me, it's definitely become about being that authentic self. And I think in so many corporate environments, there is this unspoken pressure to conform to the norms and expectations that people have. And so for much of my career, apart from one role, and they're getting a shout out, is Gromfoss, a Danish company. That's the only place I felt I could be my full self. And that's the first place I was not called HR. I actually had a name. I was called Rachel. And it was only less than 3 years ago that I revealed to the professional world my love of tattoos. And that, it's an art collection that I've been gathering up for the last 27 years. But even people that worked for me and my teams over the course of my career didn't know I had tattoos. So for me, that challenge of authenticity is widespread. And for me, it can have profound impact on both employee engagement and satisfaction. And that was really affecting me personally. And interestingly, before we caught up today, I thought, I kind of do look at a bit of my research as well and see what kind of latest stats are out there, because I love a bit of a stat. And interestingly, Deloitte did a recent report or study, and they found that 61% of employees cover up some aspect of their identity at work to fit in. And that, for me, that statistic really highlights the extent to which people feel they need to hide part of themselves. And that, like I said, that can lead to decreased job satisfaction and engagement. When people can't be themselves, it definitely affects their ability to connect with their colleagues and perform at their best. And for me, that was something I felt, I was very conscious of. And even to the point I thought, are people now not going to buy from me as a business because I decide to wear my art, not hang it on a wall? And I've just got to the point thinking, well, if that's how you're going to define whether you do business with me or not, is that the client I want? No. I've worked with that mindset for the last 25 years. I don't want to work with that mindset for another 25 years. So if my experience, my skill, all of my background don't say to you, I can do my job and with my eyes closed, nothing else will.
I think this is such an important and valuable lesson for entrepreneurs and solopreneurs and founders out there. So thank you for being so honest with us about your journey, because I know that tattoos are a deeply personal thing. I don't have any myself yet, but there's still time. Obviously, I'm still young, but I really appreciate you being really honest about your experiences there, the good and the bad. And the reason why I think it's such an important lesson for entrepreneurs and founders out there is, as much as possible, you've got to be true, your authentic, full self in the way that you're setting up your business, in the way that you're telling your story. And when you do that, when you have opinions, when you have a perspective on something, when you might represent a slightly contrarian point of view, you are going to come across people who want to publicly disagree with you, right? They're going to be those keyboard warriors that want to shout you down and tell you that you're wrong. But as you pointed out, Rachel, the opposite is also true, that you start to appeal to a certain tribe out there who are just looking for you to be that voice, to be that leadership, to be that symbol of authenticity. So you do find both when you're putting yourself out there in that way. And you're so right. When you said, do I want to work with those people? If the decision about working with me is based on what they think about tattoos, right? Are they the kind of client that I want? And I think for entrepreneurs out there and founders, ask yourself, are you willing to compromise on your values just to attract a customer? Or do you actually want people who disagree with you or who don't reflect or embody your own values in some way? It's good if they bounce off you. It's good if they bounce off your brand. You know, they're not the kind of people you're going to get on and work with well anyway. So allow them to just sort of bounce off who you are. Allow them to bounce off your content and don't worry about it. And that can be difficult for people because when you're new in business and when you're starting your own business and you're worrying about where's the next paycheck coming from, it can be challenging to be your full authentic self because you are worried about, you know, you've got to put food on the table. So you might be worried about pushing some of those potential leads and opportunities away. But ultimately, in the long term, focusing on building the tribe, the right tribe for your brand is really, really important because they're the people who are going to stick with you in the long term, and attracting the right kind of customers who are going to refer you, who are going to recommend you, who are going to celebrate you. You know, those are the kind of people that you want to attract. And you can only attract those right kind of relationships if you're being your true and authentic self. So I think your story is going to resonate hugely with lots of people who are listening in. So thank you again for being so honest about it all. Now, we are here to talk about some other things, culture, leadership challenges. And I know that you've been thinking about your culture crush, which could be a business or it could be a person. But why don't you tell us about your culture crush and why you've chosen them?
Well, naturally, I was going to say House of HR and House of Coaching, but I thought, no, that would be way too obvious. We talked too much about them already, but definitely did some hard thinking. I mean, I've already given a shout out to Gromfos, very paternal culture environment where I felt I was my authentic me. But actually, I want to give a shout out to Patagonia. And for me, that's definitely on a different side of the scale. And that's definitely their commitment to kind of that environmental sustainability. Obviously, that's what's really well known. But what actually stands out to me from them is actually their dedication to authentic leadership and employee well-being. So what I see, and obviously this is for perception of what I see from looking out in, that they've definitely built a culture where employees are encouraged to be themselves, that they align to their personal values. So, for example, I know some of the things they do is they provide on-site childcare. They encourage employees to take part in environmental activism activities. And I think they even close their doors on election days to try and encourage employees to go out there and encourage them to vote. And for me, it's about committing both the professional and the personal life, and trying to get that balance often can be difficult. And I think, truly, I feel they're kind of working towards that. But I definitely think from their approach, I definitely there's lots of companies that can learn from that emphasis. I think we could talk all day about work-life balance and holistic well-being of employees, which is one of my favourite topics as well. But I definitely think that they recognise that when an employee is happy and fulfilled in their personal life, they definitely bring more energy and creativity to work as well. I know experience that myself in what I do in my own business as well. And I think that openness and transparency definitely for me shows, you're fostering that trust and loyalty by aligning kind of the business practice with the values. But I think, they definitely attract and retain employees who are definitely passionate and committed. And that's certainly the view I get of them as a culture.
Amazing. Well, this has never worked yet, right? But when somebody recommends their culture crush on the show, I always say, you've been called out on culture crush. We'd love to have a conversation with you. And I'm hoping that one day one of these recommendations or culture crushes will buck the trend. But Patagonia, you have been given a shout out as a culture crush here on the show. Rachel and I would love to have a conversation with someone from your team.
Absolutely.
So reach out to me. Let's see if we can set up a conversation, because who knows, it might be nice to have you on a future episode, and we can invite Rachel back to join the conversation. That would be absolutely terrific. So fingers crossed, Rachel. Who knows? One day someone's gonna hear their shout out and they're gonna say, yes, I want to be on the show. Maybe this is the breakthrough moment. Now, you've also been thinking about, the world of culture inside and out. Organizational culture has been your bread and butter for a long time, managing people challenges, people opportunities, all that good stuff. So I'm really curious to know, from your perspective, what is one of the big leadership challenges that businesses are facing or organizations are facing at the moment? But why don't you take the solution with that as well? Because I'd love to hear about the challenge, but why don't you just take us straight into the solution and what you think leaders can do about that to address it?
I think I am going to come back on the that being authentic self at work. I think because it's been such part of my whole leadership journey and these last 3 years as a business owner entrepreneur as well. It's been something that you touch upon, kind of that, that journey you have as an entrepreneur. It took me a long time to find my voice and be the true me. And I think, if I look back, that was probably a real good, at least 6 months. I'm still finding it now at times. But for me, I just think, how different could my career have been if I'd been that authentic self? What path would that have taken? Hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I think this whole going back to Deloitte and that statistic around employees covering up some aspects of their identity at work, why have we got over 60% of people feeling like that at work? If we are so great at creating these cultures that create inclusivity and all this fun stuff and buzzwords we talk about, the reality is people are not feeling it. There's only a third of the organisation that feels they can show up as who they are at work. And I think, in 2024, that's a pretty sad state of affairs. And I think for me, I definitely think, in terms of the solution to that, and it's very easy to say it, but making it happen is quite a different thing. But that is fostering that culture of, psychological safety. It's an environment where employees are feeling safe to express their true selves without fear of those negative consequences, because that's what I was fearing always, what was going to be that negative outcome. And for me, so things that I would say, my top kind of tips are getting those things kind of started with, having those open conversations. Do we regularly have conversations about diversity, inclusion, personal experiences, encourage employees to share their stories and listen actively to what they've got to say. Obviously, a real obvious for me in HR as well is leadership training. So I think, can we train leaders to be much more empathetic and supportive? Absolutely, we can. I think, leaders do set the tone for an organisation. You touch upon, HR, it kind of lands that culture. But for me, totally lands in that leadership camp in terms of them setting that tone and their behaviour. That can encourage or stifle that authenticity. So I've seen, those CEOs at the top that have been their true selves and shared some real, raw things with the organisation. And you just see the kind of, the real ripple effect of positivity that has on the rest of the business to do the same. But I think it's that kind of being that modelling that authenticity. So leaders should be that model of that authentic behaviour. So if they're open about their experiences and about their vulnerabilities, it will set examples for others to do the same. And I've seen that happen and real positivity come as a result of that. And obviously, we talked about HR being the police and the authority in the organisation. So I can't get away without not talking about inclusive policy. So, we can implement policies that support that diverse expression of identity, whether that could be, for me, that'd be through a flexible dress code, inclusive benefits, support for employees through resource groups. There's loads of cool stuff out there that can make those things happen. And finally, I'd kind of probably say a feedback mechanism. So if you create that feedback mechanism where employees can share their thoughts and feelings about their workplace culture, and hopefully anonymously, that can hopefully help the organisation and leaders identify areas where they can improve moving forward. So I actually had one company where I consulted with them, and we started holding kind of regular town hall meetings, and it's a bit of an American term, but kind of all staff meetings, where the employees actually could share their personal stories and experiences. And that was supported by leadership training, which focused on kind of the empathy and the active listening. And over time, we really saw this significant shift in that workplace cultures. And actually, the great thing in terms of that feedback was employees reported feeling much more connected, engaged, and they definitely felt there was kind of increasing in collaboration and innovation amongst the teams as well, because they were rocking up as to who they wanted to be at work. And, it's easy to do and easy to say some of this stuff, but making it reality is definitely a much, much harder thing to do, but absolutely possible.
So we've got three themes, really. We've got the theme of psychological safety, we've got inclusive policies, and we've got feedback mechanisms. And I think you're absolutely right. These things are easy to talk about and sometimes hard to implement, because I think sometimes we don't have the right mechanisms or the right mental models for how we take on some of these challenges. It's one of the things that at Anthem we're trying to address. So one of the things that we've designed is a model for cultural and collective practice. We're calling it collective fluency, and it has these three elements to it. You've got intentions, which are things like mission, vision, purpose, values, that kind of stuff. What the organization has agreed that it wants to be about. This is our sense of direction in the world, right? The second part of the model is around actions. How do you translate those things into real world behaviors, marketing stories, brand positioning, things like that? Like, how does it really come to life? And the last part of the model is to do with outcomes, things like reward, recognition, and ownership. And values is an example I often use because people, we all have a relationship with organizational values, at least at some point in our career. I know that some startups don't bother with this stuff at first, but eventually it's going to show up. And values are a great example because values need to be grounded and practical using common sense language, right? So that they can translate into people's behaviors. People already, just by reading the value, have an idea of how that could work. And then through, as you say, things like policies and different ways to express what those values really mean. You might have examples of, for example, this could look like X, Y, and Z, but you might have your own ways of expressing it too, of course. Now, and then the final part of the model, so you've got the intention, the values, translating into actions, and then finally outcomes. Now, Rachel, if you worked for Anthem, right, congratulations, you've passed your probation. But one of the things I could ask you about is not just about your performance and whether you've hit your targets. One of my questions needs to be around, and how do you feel that you've embraced our organization's values? How do you feel that you've contributed to the culture by responding to some of those ideas? And if we had other employees who worked with us, your colleagues could say, "Oh, Rachel has demonstrated this value in this way." So they're really, really practical things. And as a result, you pass your probation. But not only that, you get a little promotion as well. Congratulations, you've done so well. Because it's not just about whether you've done the tasks. It's about how have you contributed to our culture and belonging to that collective identity that the organization has about itself. So I think that's a really useful model that people are free to take away and try, because as you say, when you think about how do we unpack the idea of psychological safety, or how do we implement a feedback experiment, or how do we rethink our policies to be more inclusive, sometimes just introducing that lens of thinking, okay, so what's our intention here, right? What do we want to do? And then thinking, how does that translate into action, or how is that written into the policy, or what behavior are we looking for that reflects the intention? And then finally, how do we reward people based on how they've engaged with those things? So intention, action, outcome, I think is just a really useful way to begin thinking, okay, so how do we do this stuff in reality? I could go on about this, but I won't, because it's kind of my area. But as you know, you mentioned it before, that actually building things like inclusivity into a policy can be difficult. And we know from our experience that lots of businesses love to say they've got inclusive policies, but as you say, 2/3 of people still don't feel that they can show up and be their authentic selves. So what is the missing thing? People know that inclusion is important. People even write it into their policies, but in so many workplaces up and down the country and around the world, people still don't feel that they're really included. So what's missing in all of this?
I think for me, it's like we've talked about, we can put all these things in place, we have policies, procedures, process, but we have to live and breathe it. So we have to, what we say we do, and we have to get the feedback and listen to employees as well. So if it is, kind of, lots of people talk about pulse surveys and all those fun things you can do, but how do people not feel they can arrive at work? And that's why I'm a big fan of, doing those things anonymously, because ultimately, the leaders can sit at the top and come up with all their fantastic ideas that they want. But if you're not talking to the staff and understanding what they feel, how they don't feel they can turn up as their true self as work, then you might as well not bother with anything else that you're doing in terms of those values and stuff. I mean, you talk about there with the the probation piece. I've just worked with a client recently that we've built that into kind of that annual review process as well, in terms of, how, one, do they even know what the values were? And two, how did they rate against them? How were they showing up at work with those, And I felt, and that's an organization that's really, really embraced people being their authentic self. And, you could get a real sense of that when you walk in the organization, that that's an organization I can turn up and I can have my tattoos on show if I want to. They're not all suddenly going to turn around and think, oh my God, who's this turns up with tattoos in the room? And for me, that's the thing that's really quite powerful about, it's the living and breathing from the top down, but getting that feedback coming back up. Simple, but absolutely effective.
I think feedback is such a crucial part of this story, because things like inclusion can be a really sensitive and difficult subject for organizations to broach. But I think you're right about how we can use feedback, because you could almost run a feedback experiment that says, we are specifically going to take action around inclusion, but rather than kind of going behind closed doors and having private conversations and a few heads coming up with a few good ideas, because they bring their own bias to those conversations, right? They're not necessarily aware of their own blind spots. What you could do is say, hey, as a team or an organization, we want to do more around this issue, but everybody's got their own opinion, and they're all, each one is equally important. So we're going to start doing some feedback sessions around this particular conversation and use that dialogue. And then you're sort of practicing both. You're practicing feedback, which is good for the organization anyway, and you're beginning to gently tackle a big emotive topic that you want to see change or transform in your business. So you can use them both in tandem, bring the questions about inclusion into that feedback experiment. And I'm sure, Rachel, you'll be happy for this, but if you are listening to this and you're thinking, yes, I want to do some of that, reach out to Rachel or reach out to me, because we've got ideas, right? We've got ideas about feedback experiments you could run, and we'd be happy to help. Who knows? We might end up working together and collaborating on something. Wouldn't that be lovely?
It would be.
And
I think the good, sorry to interrupt you there, but often it will be, oh, we'll do a survey, and yeah, people get survey fatigue and all this stuff. Where I see it work well is where you're facilitating kind of a feedback group and really getting that kind of, if it's facilitated well, you and I know you can get really some great golden nuggets out of those kind of sessions as well. And and it takes time, but absolutely things that can be really quite transformational in the long term.
absolutely right. And just revisiting the model that I mentioned, the model of collective fluency I mentioned before, when I talk about an intentions, right, intentions has a dark side to it. And what I mean is this: when an organization does do things like inclusive policy shaping behind closed doors, or doesn't use feedback to shape those conversations, what you end up with is an intention that's been decided on by a select few, by a clique, by one or two high-level leaders who might be disconnected from the way the rest of the organization is feeling. And what happens is that intention, because it can't actually live in the organization, as you mentioned before, it can't translate into people's behaviors, right? It's just a top-level decision that doesn't really trickle down. What you end up with is not an intention, because an intention has to be active. It has to have ways to live in the organization. Instead, what you end up with is a piece of propaganda. It's something the organization says about itself, right? We're really inclusive here, but doesn't really translate into the real world experience that people live day to day, because people are thinking, well, we say that we're an inclusive organization, but that's not my experience. When there's that disconnect, you no longer have an intention that gives you a sense of direction. You have a piece of propaganda, and you end up having to try and force that on people or get people to obey it, and it doesn't work. What you need is an intention and a way that you can translate that into people's behaviors and into people's actions. That's how cultures change, right? Now, we're coming to the end of our time together, Rachel, but I wanted to ask you this. We love to be practical. We love to end on just one thing for people to take away and try, or take away and think about. What would you love for people to take action with, or consider, or do as soon as this episode finishes, and why?
So, having thought about this, the most important takeaway for me today is a value of authenticity in the workplace. So I would ask people to start reflect on how you can be more authentic in your role, and how you can support others actually to do the same. So a practical starting point for me today or tomorrow is to share something personal with your team they might not know about you. So it could be tattoos, couldn't it? But hopefully that will help build trust and open the doors for others to share that as well. Because for me, ultimately, authenticity fosters that sense of belonging. It can transform the workplace into a much more engaging and innovative one.
That is a wonderful place for us to come into land. I love that idea. Find someone, practice a bit of openness and vulnerability, and see what new depths of relationship you can form. And honestly, it might be the difference between you having a pretty naff day to actually having a really, really good day. So go and give that a go. Rachel, it's been so wonderful welcoming you onto the show. I'm so glad we were able to make this happen after a few weeks of effort, but not much reward. Thank you so much for making some time for Culture Crush, and let's speak again soon.
Definitely. And thank you. It's been great to be here.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please do your thing and like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a culture first leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.